And it was one of those nights, do you ever have one of those nights where you feel like the mojo was with you and you knew you could just do nothing wrong, that everything was going to go your way?
Fame and fortune don't always stay together. Some of the biggest names in entertainment history earned tens of millions of dollars, only to watch it all disappear through bad investments, bad advice, and lifestyles nobody could sustain forever. Behind every red carpet appearance and blockbuster paycheck was sometimes a far more complicated financial story than the public ever saw. Today we're counting down bankrupt 10 Hollywood legends who lost their fortunes. Number 10, Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage built one of the most bankable careers in modern Hollywood, starring in blockbusters like Con Air, Face/Off, and National Treasure, along with an Academy Award-winning performance in Leaving Las Vegas. Between 1996 and 2011 alone, Cage reportedly earned more than $150 million from acting work, a run that made him one of the highest-paid stars of his generation. At the height of his earning power, Cage's fortune was estimated at around $150 million, making him one of the wealthiest actors of his generation. But Cage was also famous for a spending style that matched his larger-than-life screen persona. He purchased more than a dozen homes around the world, including a countryside estate in Rhode Island, a waterfront property in Newport Beach, and even a pair of castles in Europe, one located in Germany and another in the United Kingdom. His collection of vehicles at one point included dozens of cars and motorcycles, among them a custom red Lamborghini once built for the Shah of Iran. He also owned 4 super yachts, several albino king cobras, a dinosaur skull he reportedly outbid Leonardo DiCaprio for, and even a pyramid-shaped tomb in New Orleans' historic St. Louis Cemetery that he purchased for his own future burial, a purchase that remains one of the most talked-about oddities of his spending history to this day. The spending eventually caught up with him. In 2008, Cage was hit with a smaller but embarrassing IRS bill of roughly $660,000 after improperly deducting personal travel expenses on his private jet. When the broader real estate market crashed in the late 2000s, Cage found himself deeply over-leveraged, with mortgages on properties he could no longer afford. By 2009, he owed roughly $14 million to the IRS and various creditors, and he later sued his former business manager, alleging the advice he received had pushed him toward financial ruin. Cage has since clarified that he never actually filed for bankruptcy, despite widespread reports suggesting otherwise. But he came close enough that he spent the following decade taking on dozens of films, many of them smaller direct-to-video productions, specifically to work his way out of debt. Speaking about that period years later, Cage said the work became something of a guardian angel for him, allowing him to slowly pay back what he owed without ever having to file for court protection. Today, his net worth is estimated at around $25 million, a fraction of what he once had, but a stable foundation he has managed to protect ever since. Cage has continued acting steadily in the years since, and while he has acknowledged in interviews that financial pressure still factors into some of the roles he chooses, he has also said he never regretted the eccentric purchases that defined his younger years, viewing them as simply part of who he is. Number 9, Kim Basinger. Kim Basinger was one of the defining leading ladies of the 1980s and 1990s, first catching the public's attention opposite Sean Connery in the James Bond film Never Say Never Again, before going on to star in 9.5 Weeks, Batman, and later winning an Academy Award for her performance in L.A. Confidential. In 1989, at the peak of her career, Basinger made an unusual investment that would go on to define much of her financial story. Alongside her brother and a pension fund partner, she purchased roughly 1,700 acres of Brazelton, Georgia, for $20 million, with a vision of transforming the small town into a film production hub complete with movie studios, a festival circuit, and a tourist destination. It was an ambitious idea, but it came years before Georgia would actually become the filming hotspot it is known as today, and the plan struggled to get off the ground, despite Basinger personally investing several $100,000 of her own money into restoring the town's historic bank building at its center. Basinger's financial troubles deepened in 1993 after she withdrew from the controversial film Boxing Helena, a project she had reportedly verbally agreed to star in before backing out. The film's production company, Mainline Pictures, sued her for breach of contract, and a Los Angeles jury awarded a verdict of nearly $9 million, later reduced to $7.4 million on top of legal fees. Unable to post the bond required to appeal the judgment, Basinger filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1993. Her stake in Brazelton became part of the bankruptcy proceedings, and much of the town was eventually sold off in pieces to satisfy her creditors. A story so unusual, it later inspired elements of the hit sitcom Schitt's Creek. Basinger eventually settled the Boxing Helena judgment for a reduced amount on appeal, a resolution that came only after years of costly litigation that reportedly ran into the millions of dollars in combined legal fees on both sides. She married actor Alec Baldwin later that same year, and though their marriage and subsequent divorce brought their own set of financial and legal battles, Basinger rebuilt her career and continued acting in the years that followed, including a return to the spotlight in the 50 Shades film series decades later. Looking back on that period of her life in later interviews, Basinger has described the bankruptcy and the years of litigation that followed as one of the most difficult stretches of her professional life, but also one she was ultimately able to move past without it defining the rest of her career. Number 8. MC Hammer. Few stories capture the highs and lows of fame quite like MC Hammer's. Born Stanley Kirk Burrell, Hammer got his start working as a bat boy for the Oakland Athletics before breaking into music, and he became one of the biggest names in music at the turn of the 1990s, with hits like You Can't Touch This and Too Legit 2, quit turning him into a global sensation and earning him an estimated $70 million at his commercial peak. Hammer spent much of that fortune on an extravagant lifestyle built around his 40,000 square foot mansion in Fremont, California. He had purchased the property for $12 million and then poured more than $30 million into renovations, adding gold-plated fixtures, marble floors, a bowling alley, tennis courts, 2 swimming pools, and a private recording studio. He also employed an entourage of roughly 200 people, with monthly payroll costs reportedly reaching $500,000, and he kept a stable of luxury cars, racehorses, and even a private jet and helicopter. As musical tastes shifted in the mid-1990s and album sales slowed, Hammer's income could no longer keep pace with his expenses. In April 1996, he filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, listing debts of roughly $13 million against assets of only about $9.5 million. His famous mansion was eventually sold at a steep loss, and his financial troubles with the IRS continued for nearly 2 decades afterward, with tax liens surfacing again as recently as 2013. Rather than disappear from public life, Hammer reinvented himself in the years that followed, becoming an ordained minister, a motivational speaker, and eventually a respected voice in Silicon Valley's tech investment scene, where he built a second career advising and investing in early-stage startups. He has spoken openly in interviews about the lessons he took from that period, often noting that he does not regret the experiences his earlier wealth allowed him to have, even as he acknowledges the financial mismanagement that followed them. Number 7. Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds was the biggest box office draw in the world for 5 consecutive years between 1978 and 1982, a run recognized annually by the Quigley Poll of theater owners, and a feat few actors before or since have matched. Headlining hits like Smokey and the Bandit, The Longest Yard, and The Cannonball Run. At his peak, his fortune was estimated at around $60 million, along with a private jet, multiple mansions, and a level of stardom few actors of his era could match. A run that began with his breakout role in the 1972 thriller Deliverance and carried him through more than a decade as one of the industry's most reliable box office attractions. His financial troubles began building in the early 1990s, driven in large part by his costly divorce from actress Lonnie Anderson in 1993, along with a series of failed business ventures, including an investment in a restaurant chain that never lived up to expectations. His sprawling Florida estate, known as Valhalla, became an increasingly heavy financial burden, requiring constant upkeep that Reynolds struggled to afford, even as his acting income slowed. By December 1996, Reynolds had no choice but to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, listing around $6.5 million in assets against roughly $11 million in debts. His list of creditors included major studios, the IRS, talent agencies, and even his personal toupee maker, to whom he reportedly owed over $100,000. Thanks to Florida's generous homestead exemption laws, Reynolds was able to keep his beloved Valhalla estate through the bankruptcy process, and he emerged from Chapter 11 in 1998, the same year he earned an Academy Award nomination for his performance in Boogie Nights. Unfortunately, his financial struggles didn't end there. In 2011, his bank pursued foreclosure on the same Florida property after he fell behind on mortgage payments, and, in his later years, he sold off large portions of his personal memorabilia collection, including awards and costumes from his most famous films, to help make ends meet. Reynolds passed away in September 2018 at the age of 82, still remembered as one of the most bankable stars Hollywood ever produced. In the years before his death, Reynolds pushed back against the narrative that he was broke, telling reporters during his 2014 memorabilia auction in Las Vegas that he was simply downsizing a lifetime's worth of collected keepsakes rather than facing financial desperation, even as many observers pointed to his decades-long history of debt as the more likely explanation. Number 6. Gary Coleman. Gary Coleman became a household name as a child actor, starring as Arnold Jackson on the hit sitcom Different Strokes throughout the late 1970s and 1980s. A role that came after earlier appearances on shows like The Jeffersons and Good Times helped introduce him to television audiences. At the peak of his fame, Coleman was earning around $100,000 per episode, contributing to a trust fund that should have been worth as much as $18 million by the time he reached adulthood. Instead, when Coleman turned 18 and gained access to the fund, he discovered it contained only about $220,000. In 1989, he sued his adoptive parents and former business manager, alleging they had misappropriated his childhood earnings for their own benefit, a case that took years to work through the California court system before finally being resolved. After a lengthy legal battle, Coleman won a judgment of roughly $1.3 million, but by the time legal fees, taxes, and years of accumulated medical costs related to a lifelong kidney condition were accounted for, very little of that settlement remained. With his acting career slowing and no steady income to fall back on, Coleman filed for bankruptcy in 1999. He took on a series of jobs outside the entertainment industry to support himself, most notably working as a security guard, a fact that drew significant media attention given his earlier fame. Coleman continued to appear in occasional television cameos over the following decade, including guest spots on shows like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and in 2003, he even entered the crowded field of candidates running for governor of California during that year's unusual recall election, a race that drew national attention for its unconventional list of contenders. He passed away in May 2010 at the age of 42, following complications from a fall at his Utah home. closing out a life that had swung dramatically between extraordinary early fame and prolonged financial hardship. Coleman's story became one of the most frequently cited examples of the risks faced by child actors, and it later contributed to expanded protections for young performers' earnings, building on similar reforms first prompted by other child stars of earlier generations. Number 5. Wayne Newton. Wayne Newton spent decades as one of the most recognizable performers on the Las Vegas Strip, so closely associated with the city that he earned the nickname Mr. Las Vegas, having first taken the stage there as a teenager in the late 1950s, before building a career that would eventually span more than 6 decades. Known for his signature song, Danke Schoen, Newton was ranked by Forbes as the world's highest-paid entertainer in 1983, at the height of a career built on sold-out residencies and constant touring. His financial troubles began after a business dispute involving his partial ownership stake in the Aladdin Hotel, which he had purchased roughly a decade earlier, and which led him to file a libel lawsuit against NBC after the network reported he had partnered with organized crime figures to help finance the purchase. Newton initially won a $19 million judgment against the network in 1986, later reduced to just over $5 million. But a federal appeals court overturned the ruling in 1990, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his final appeal the following year. The legal fees from years of litigation piled up alongside a series of poor investments he had made throughout the 1980s. By 1992, the financial pressure had become unmanageable, and Newton filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, citing roughly $20 million in debt. The proceedings were complicated by the fact that much of his personal wealth was tied up in a holding company structure used to manage his business affairs, which made untangling his finances a lengthy process. Newton worked his way back to financial stability by the end of the decade, continuing to perform in Las Vegas well into his 70s, but his tax troubles resurfaced periodically over the following years, including a dispute with the IRS in 2005 over roughly $1.8 million in back taxes. Despite those setbacks, Newton remained a fixture of the Las Vegas entertainment scene for decades, continuing to perform and make public appearances long after his financial struggles first made headlines. He eventually sold his longtime Las Vegas estate, known as Casa de Shenandoah, which was later converted into a museum celebrating his decades of contributions to the city's entertainment history, a fitting legacy for a performer so closely tied to the identity of the Strip itself. Number 4. Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson had already spent decades as one of country music's most beloved figures, known for hits like On the Road, Again, and Always on My Mind, when his financial world came crashing down in dramatic fashion. His troubles stemmed from tax shelter investments made in the early 1980s on the advice of his accounting firm, investments the IRS later ruled illegal. What began as a $2 million tax dispute snowballed into an enormous debt once interest and penalties were added, and by 1990, the IRS placed the total bill at $32 million. On November 9, 1990, federal agents seized nearly all of Nelson's assets across 6 states, padlocking his properties and freezing his bank accounts, taking everything from master tapes and platinum records to touring equipment and even his personal clothing. Fortunately, Nelson's daughter had already sent his beloved guitar, nicknamed Trigger, to Hawaii for safekeeping before the raids took place. After negotiations, the IRS reduced the total debt to $16.7 million, still an overwhelming sum for Nelson to pay off. In a creative response to the crisis, Nelson released an album in 1992 titled The IRS Tapes, Who'll Buy My Memories, featuring stripped-down acoustic recordings, with revenue from sales going directly toward paying down his debt under a formal agreement with the tax agency. When his assets went up for auction in early 1991, many of Nelson's devoted fans purchased his belongings themselves and quietly returned them to him once the ordeal was over, including the ranch that had been in his family, with one fan reportedly buying it as a thank you for Nelson's years of work co-founding the Farm Aid Benefit Concert Series to support struggling American farmers. In February 1993, Nelson finally reached a full settlement with the IRS, agreeing to pay a reduced amount over several years, with the final payment made in 1995. Nelson returned to touring and recording in the years that followed, eventually rebuilding a net worth estimated today at around $25 million. Looking back on the ordeal, Nelson has said he never lost his sense of humor about the situation, even joking in interviews that the whole experience gave him plenty of new material to write about. Toni Braxton emerged as one of the defining R&B voices of the 1990s, with her ballad "Unbreak My Heart" becoming one of the signature hits of the decade, earning her a Grammy Award and helping her sophomore album, Secrets, sell more than 6 million copies in the United States alone. Yet despite her music generating well over $170 million in worldwide sales across her first two albums, Braxton later revealed she had received a royalty check for less than $2,000 from her earliest recording contract, a detail that stunned audiences when she first shared it publicly years afterward on national television. Her deal with Arista and LaFace Records required her to cover the costs of touring, wardrobe, studio time, and music videos out of her own earnings, leaving her with far less than the public assumed given her level of success. In January 1998, just weeks after suing her label to be released from her contract, Braxton filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, a move that shocked fans given how prominently her music had dominated the charts. Braxton eventually reached a settlement with her label, reportedly worth $20 million, though a 10-year confidentiality agreement kept the details private until she discussed it publicly years later. She rebuilt her career throughout the 2000s, releasing new music and starring on Broadway before launching a self-financed Las Vegas residency at the Flamingo Hotel in 2006, a show that proved successful enough in its first year to be extended into an ongoing engagement. That residency came to an abrupt halt in 2007 after Braxton experienced a health emergency during a live performance, forcing her to cancel the remaining shows. Because she had personally financed the production costs through her own company, the cancellation left her responsible for a wave of expenses with no revenue to offset them. And in 2010, Braxton filed for bankruptcy a second time, with reported debts as high as $18 million against just over $1.5 million in assets. Braxton has continued performing and recording in the years since, including her long-running reality series Braxton Family Values, though she has spoken candidly about losing the rights to many of her most successful songs as a result of her financial history. Despite those setbacks, she has continued to release new music and remains a respected figure in R&B, with a career that has spanned more than 3 decades and 7 Grammy Awards in total. Number 2, Randy Quaid. Randy Quaid built a respected career in film throughout the 1970s and 1980s, earning an Academy Award nomination for The Last Detail and becoming widely recognized for his role as Cousin Eddie in the National Lampoon's Vacation films, along with memorable supporting turns in Independence Day and the Golden Globe-winning television film LBJ: The Early Years. Behind the scenes, however, Quaid's finances began unraveling well before the public troubles that would later dominate headlines. In 2000, Quaid and his wife, Evie, filed for bankruptcy in Los Angeles, listing roughly $3.5 million in debt tied in part to a film project called The Debtors, which fell apart amid legal disputes with its financier, technology entrepreneur, Charles Simonyi. The couple later claimed that a former business manager and estate planner had mismanaged and, in their view, misappropriated their assets over the following years, filing lawsuits accusing former advisors of orchestrating a scheme to gain control of their property and earnings, including claims involving a Montecito home they said had never actually been sold, despite records showing otherwise. Quaid's financial and legal troubles escalated significantly by the late 2000s. In 2010, he and Evi were arrested after being found living in the guest house of a Montecito, California, a state they had once owned but no longer held title to, resulting in felony vandalism and unauthorized entry charges. Rather than face the case in the United States, the couple fled to Canada, where they publicly stated they were escaping a group they described as being responsible for financially and professionally targeting them and other celebrities. Canadian authorities ultimately denied Quaid's request for permanent residency, and after years of legal wrangling, the couple crossed back into the United States through Vermont in 2015, where a judge dismissed the extradition case against them due to a lack of sufficient evidence. Quaid's acting career largely came to a standstill during this period, and his net worth has been reported in recent years as a negative figure, reflecting the debts and legal costs that piled up over more than 2 decades of financial and legal turmoil. He and Evi eventually settled in Vermont, and while Quaid has made only occasional brief returns to acting since, he has continued to maintain publicly that the financial troubles he experienced were the result of deliberate wrongdoing by people he once trusted with his career and his money. Number 1. 50 Cent. Curtis Jackson, known worldwide by his stage name 50 Cent, rose to fame in the early 2000s with his debut album, Get Rich or Die Tryin', which sold more than 12 million copies worldwide and later inspired a semi-autobiographical film of the same name, helping build a business empire that eventually included music, film, and television. One of his most lucrative ventures came through an early endorsement and ownership stake in the vitamin water brand, which earned him a reported $100 million when the company was sold to Coca-Cola in 2007. At his financial peak in the early 2010s, Jackson's net worth was estimated at well over $100 million. But a string of costly legal judgments began chipping away at that fortune. In 2015, a New York jury ordered him to pay millions of dollars in damages after he was found to have posted an intimate video of a woman online without her consent, a judgment that ultimately grew to $7 million once punitive damages were added. Just days after that ruling, in July 2015, Jackson filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in a Connecticut court, listing both his assets and liabilities in the range of $10 to $50 million. Rather than eliminating his debts entirely, the Chapter 11 filing allowed him to reorganize his finances under court supervision while continuing to earn income from his ongoing business ventures. During the proceedings, a bankruptcy judge grew concerned about photos Jackson had posted on social media showing him surrounded by large piles of cash, questioning whether he had been fully transparent about his assets during the case. In July 2016, the court approved his repayment plan, and Jackson ultimately settled his roughly $32 million in debt by paying around $22 million, funded in part by a separate legal malpractice settlement he won against a former law firm. His bankruptcy case was formally discharged in February 2017, and Jackson has since continued to build his business ventures, including his role as a television producer, restoring much of the wealth and success he had built in the years before his financial setback. He has spoken since about the experience as a turning point that pushed him to diversify his income across television production, spirits, and other business ventures, rather than relying primarily on music. Looking back at these 10 stories, it becomes clear just how quickly even the largest Hollywood fortunes can unravel, whether through bad investments, expensive lawsuits, unreliable advisors, or simply spending faster than the money was coming in. Some of these stars like Nicolas Cage, Willie Nelson, and 50 Cent, managed to work their way back to financial stability, treating their financial collapse as a lesson to build smarter the second time around. Others, like Gary Coleman and Burt Reynolds, carried the weight of those early setbacks for the rest of their lives, never quite reaching the level of security they had once taken for granted. What ties all of these stories together is a reminder that fame and fortune, no matter how enormous, were never guaranteed to last, and that the pressures of maintaining a public image often came with a private cost few fans ever saw at the time. If you enjoyed learning about these dramatic financial falls and comebacks, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the highs and lows behind Hollywood's biggest names.